Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and, as we're getting our cupcakes, get into the heart of the matter for this evening, which is our budget discussion. Mr. Shields, would you like to maybe kind of lead the discussion? I know you've been asked previously to scrub the budget and take a look at the budget and some ideas you might have for members of council for consideration. Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I've got one to read, too. Do you want to go ahead and go first? Feel free to.
I have consulted with the city attorney and make the following declaration before city council's consideration of the proposed fiscal year 2016 city budget. I am an employee of the Falls Church City School Board, and therefore I'm a member of a group of 3 or more persons that may be affected by the approval of the FY 2016 budget. I can participate in the transaction fairly, objectively, and in the public interest.
Thank you. I've got a similar disclosure to read as well. I have consulted with the city attorney and make the following declaration for city council's consideration of the proposed fiscal year 2016 city budget. My wife is employed as a clinic aide in the Falls Church Public Schools. I am, however, a member of a group of 3 or more persons that may be affected by the approval of FY16 budget and can participate in the transaction fairly, objectively, in the public interest. Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Mayor Tarter and members of council. So we'll start just with an update as to where things are right now. As the council is aware, we have had changes to the budget and our costs for health insurance premiums for employees for both school and city government employees, and also some changes on the revenue side with respect to ambulance fees. In addition, the school board has asked that the school bus, which was in the transfer request, that be debt financed, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. We have a number of things that we plan to debt finance on the general government side, and we would add that bus to that. So as a result, the current budget gap is $943,000, which is the equivalent of 2.5 cents on the real estate tax rate. And so the council has asked for items for its consideration that would further close that gap, and so I'd like to go through some items for your consideration. So if you take the middle of the page of the handout that I've just provided to the City Council, some expenditure changes that I would put forward for consideration. One is in the school transfer, and that is the school campus planning that is in the transfer request. If that's taken.
Ask one question. As we're going through this, I think this is really helpful. If you can just kind of underscore what's a cut and what's sort of moving money around or being bond funded as we go through.
Okay. The school campus planning, so that would be taken out of the transfer and out of the operating budget and moved instead. It's a one-time expenditure. We would move it into the capital program. We would do a budget amendment when the costs for that are known, and we would use our capital reserves to pay for it. So that would be moving it from the operating budget to be paid for out of capital reserves. And the capital reserves that are available for that purpose are the 85% water fund sale proceeds. An additional one just below that is $100,000 of local tax-supported funding for WMATA. We've discussed at the last work session using our NVTA 30% funds to meet our WMATA obligations. This is an option for FY16 only. It's a perfectly appropriate use of NVTA funds. However, we can use them for FY16 only because we have in FY16 a local match, a local C&I match in the form of a contribution to their capital program, which we're planning to do through a debt issuance. It would be on the city's books. But we can leverage that debt issuance in order to take advantage of the NVTA funds in FY16. Debt refunding in the amount of $305,000. This is something that the council had presented to it last year in the amount of $280,000. So it's an option that we bring forward for consideration again this year. And what this is when we issue bonds, and this year we issued bonds for the Mount Daniel Elementary School. In the process of the sale of those bonds, we have transaction fees, we have the cost of issuance that we factor into the bonds, and then also through the process of the bidding process, occasionally there are premiums that are paid by the bidders. And in this case, the amount of it in total was $305,000. In our review of that, our intent was to use that to defray a future bond issuance. For instance, in the CIP, we have $2 million for Thomas Jefferson Elementary School HVAC overhaul or renovation. And so that $305,000 was planned to be used to defray that future bond issuance. That's the type of thing that it could be used for. Another eligible use for it, though, is to immediately use it to refund or to pay down the debt service. And so that is an eligible use of it in FY16. It is, however, a one-time source of funding, so in FY17, your debt service is going to spring back to its normal costs, and there will need to be, in FY17, an additional $305,000 of revenues for that purpose. The catch position, this was in the preliminary markup where the council did ask for funding for catch. The $25,000 is what has been requested by the arts community, and so we plugged that number in. And then the treasurer position of $80,000, that's tied to revenue collections that you'll see just 3 lines below it, so we'll talk about them together. So the position would cost $80,000 in our initial calculation, and speaking with the treasurer just prior to this meeting, we think actually that number could be a little bit lower than $80,000. This would be a 1-year term staff member whose job would be to do tax collections, parking fee collections, and that type of thing. We would project $180,000 based on the treasurer's information about revenues that could be generated through that effort. And so we show that $180,000 as additional revenue in the budget. Going back up then to the Falls Church Volunteer Fire Department, this also was a late arriving number, and it relates to insurance costs for the volunteer apparatus. So we've put that in to the, for the council's consideration as you're doing your final markup as well at the request of the volunteers. I will note, and frankly, that they've requested more money than that, but in discussions with them, that's a number that I would bring forward and recommend to you. But they have requested a larger number than that. Revenue changes then, we've already talked about the revenue collections of $180,000. The investment returns figure, this would reflect increased investment returns if the funds placed in the VIP were increased to $15 million. And so we put that forward for consideration as well. Those are our best projection as to what those investment returns could be. So the net impact of those changes sum to $602,100 and leave a remaining gap of $341,000 or $349,958. There's additional discussion on the next page. If council likes, I can just go through that information pretty quickly, and then we can go back to further discussion on these gap closing measures. One question that the council had was, if we were to fund the school bus and the police radios with debt, what would be the interest cost? So listed below that are the items that we would propose for 5-year term debt issuance. We assume a 4.5% interest for that. So that would be for 2 dump trucks, 3 police vehicles, 1 school bus, and the police radio replacements. All in sum, then that's a $1,059,000 5-year debt issuance for those items, and over the life of that 5 years, the interest cost would be $142,000. based on our projections and those assumptions that are listed above. I would note that per the prior adopted capital improvements program and the CIP that's now before the City Council, we've listed the other items that we would anticipate going to market for debt in the coming year. The debt service would begin in FY17, and that includes our contribution to the WMATA capital program of $1.4 million. That again allows us to leverage the NVTA funds to pay for our WMATA operating costs contribution in FY16. And then the firearms range, which was approved in last year's budget for $300,000, $6 million for the City Hall expansion and renovation approved in FY15, the City Hall Task Force recommendations that's in the FY16 budget, and the TGA HVAC system of $2 million. So that's a quick summary of those anticipated debt issues for the coming year. And then lastly, just 2 points. The George Mason High School planning. We did have $250,000 budgeted in FY15, of which approximately $150,000 remains unexpended at this point. And so this can be, as we consider funding this planning work over the coming year, we could either put in a number for adoption on April 27th, or, and my recommendation would be to later in the year, once we have a clearer picture of what those planning costs will be, plug in a number by way of a budget amendment at a later date. And then lastly, how could the transportation planner be funded? There's been a good deal of discussion of this position. What its purpose would be is to provide staff support for the city at the regional transportation planning meetings. There are a lot of very important funding and policy discussions happening at those regional meetings. We're able to attend some of them, but we do miss a good number of those and try to participate virtually when we can and using our relationships. But this would enhance our involvement in those regional discussions and give us more leverage in looking out for the city's interests. And it would also allow us, we believe, to have greater capacity to implement transportation projects in the city, and our discussions with potential applicants for the position, one area of interest is in the neighborhood traffic calming program. And so the way we could fund that position, we have $80,000 in FY15 that was done in the current fiscal year. We have conducted interviews, and we could move forward with that higher. We would not expend that full $80,000 in FY15. We would carry forward whatever is unexpended and get us through FY17 through the use of development fees. I'm sorry, FY16 through the use of development fees and charging a portion of the salary to actual capital projects. But then the sustained funding for the position would need to be for discussion FY17, something that would provide a more regular source of funding for that. But that would be a strategy to get us through FY16 at least. We did advertise the recruitment for that position as a term position, and so the applicants are aware of that consideration. So that's a quick summary of items that we've been working on in response to the council's request, and be happy to answer any questions on them.
I just have a few questions or comments. I'll sort of be systematic.
A couple questions.
Vice Mayor Snyder?
First of all, thanks to everyone for a lot of good work so far. Question is, how are we reflecting in the budget the vehicles, the dump truck, the police vehicles, the school bus, and the police radio replacements? In other words, that's on page 2. What effect does it have on page 1?
What will happen is there'll be a line for capital outlay that will cover all but $90,000, and we will reflect a funding source which would be bond proceeds as the revenue source, and the 90,000 would remain in the school transfer. It's just funded with a different source, which will be the bond proceeds.
But that's on
We're
the-
not going to buy the vehicle and give it to the school. We're
Right,
going to
that's-
give the
that's-
school the money to buy the bus.
If that's on the school bus.
Yes, and the other items will show up as capital outlay in the respective departments' budgets and be
Okay,
funded
and-
by bond proceeds.
Right, and the police radios now. So all I'm trying to figure out is, does your bottom line number here of remaining gap include whatever the cost would be for bond funding the school buses and the police?
That gap
radio?
would not change.
That wouldn't change, so that doesn't affect that, okay.
And just briefly, the reason is we'd be issuing the debt forward in FY16, and so the debt service begins in FY17.
Right, but,
So there is a cost, but it begins in FY17.
okay. Because personally, Mr. Mayor, I don't want to have our police equipped with anything other than absolute state-of-the-art. So,
I think that's why it's in the CIP. You're concerned about that.
next question I have is really for the CFO. I know the projections are a certain amount of increased revenue collections per the treasurer's proposal, but to build in $180,000 in our budget, assuming the person is going to be able to raise that much, some might say is kind of sort of counting your chickens before they hatch, or before, well, I'm going any further than that. So the question is, from a finance standpoint, is this a legitimate approach to take here? Because I don't want to start sort of counting stuff in this year's budget, and I know no one intends that actually will end up creating a potential gap next year.
We will have to monitor all our revenue closely. We are at the limit in terms of our revenue estimates. These two items that have been added just put an additional stress on those revenue estimates, but we will monitor them, and I will come to you at the earliest point in the next fiscal year to tell you where we are and what steps we have to take to remedy it.
If I could just jump in for a second, follow up if you don't mind. So, first off, is this a temporary position or is this a forever position? How is this being
It's
characterized?
a term position.
Term position, so that means it's for a finite term of
Yes.
what, 1 year? or
It's
s-
only for the fiscal year, just like the transportation planner would be.
I got you. So then there's not the real risk that we have a employee for life, really, because we're telling that person before they, begin their duties that this is a 1 year position.
That's correct.
So really our downside is the 1 year, what might happen in that 1 year.
That's
Correct.
correct.
Can we terminate it before a year? Or do we have to hire them? Is it like a 1 year contract, or is it something where we could say after 6 months, we're not getting the revenue, the return on this that we wanted? Do you know?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And so if we were to do this, could we get, for example, like monthly updates or quarterly updates, some kind of regular updates as to how this is working out?
Yes, you can.
And the treasurer seems to be nodding her head as well. So, okay.
I guess, Mr. Mayor, my question doesn't go to the position. My question goes to estimating the additional collections and then building that into this year's budget. States in particular have gotten themselves into a lot of trouble with rosy predictions about what they're going to end up with, and it ends up being a lot less. So my question is a transaction like this a legitimate, reasonable thing for us to do and consistent with good government accounting standards?
I can only say the same thing I said previously, Councilmember Snyder, that all the revenues are at their limits, so we'll have to monitor them closely.
I guess the question is, and again, I don't want to spend any more time on this than this. The question is basically, is this an acceptable accounting practice to do this, to build it, to create a position and to say that position is going to have X amount of tax collection, so we include that as revenue as though it were sales tax or something else?
It is not out of the question.
Pardon?
It is not out of the question to do that. To create a position with the intent of collecting a certain amount of revenue is not.
And to reflect those revenue projections in this year's budget would be an acceptable accounting practice.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Mr. Brook?
Picking up on that point, I think that's sort of similar to what we did with red light cams, right?
We did, that's correct.
But I think we then later adjusted it downward because that was the goal of that program, right?
Yeah, for the red light program, we did traffic counts, and so there was data behind it to substantiate the projections.
No, but the goal was that ultimately the number of violations would go down because
That's
people
correct.
would be on notice, right?
That's right.
So my question here is, I believe that we have data on outstanding, uncollected, just call them bills. Do we think that that's going to be an ongoing issue, or do we think that that's going to sort of resolve itself because we'll be timely collecting? Therefore, you cannot then plug in this number next year.
I will offer my opinion on it. I think that it's a number that we will need to keep track of. In other words, that any additions to certain revenue line items that we do in FY16 because of this position, we will remember that when we're doing our forecast next year and treat them accordingly. Because my understanding from the treasurer is that there are some areas where additional attention would be helpful, but they may not be perpetual and in terms of a source of revenue. And the treasurer could probably speak to that better than I
one of
can
us.
directly. But I will say this, when next year when we're doing our revenue projections, we'll be mindful of what was done here.
I think I sort of understand that, and I think what I've seen in some of the documents is that there's potentially for this year, there's a lot of uncollected bills, but that is likely to stream way down once we get more current. Is that fair?
That's fair.
That we should be prepared to sort of absorb, if we're going to keep this position, that it would just be a position that may at best pay for itself without generating any additional revenue down the line. Is that also fair?
That's fair.
So
Why don't we get would you mind having the treasurer get up and she can answer? I think we get more accurate information from her. And from what I understand, it sounds like there's sort of a backlog, which is one category, which I think you're referring to.
Right.
But then there may also be higher collection rates because people.
that's
are
what I'm
more-
saying.
And that is the second category.
Eventually, it may be a net neutral. The position would pay for itself based on current collection efforts, which
I
would be
think
about
it would
80 grand.
pay for itself and then some eventually. The first year, yes, the collections are going to be higher. We do have a backlog. The treasurer's office has never collected red light camera, parking tickets, special pickup bills, stuff like that. So we want to start collecting those because we need to, and we can. We have the authority from the state to do that. We're still collecting the water bills. So, but obviously, I think we've only got a window of about another year where, before those start to dry up. But I did a memo. I think I sent you guys all a copy, but I'll just sort of recap it.
And I think what I'm driving at, we don't.
Okay, sorry.
What I'm sort of interested in is, given that it's a term 1 year position, it's something I'd be supportive of because I think from what I'm hearing, the notions of collection and given the past, we hopefully can collect. You have some formula for capturing it. You're not going to be able to capture all the debt,
Right.
but at least some of them. So for 1 year, we're okay. What I would be interested in moving forward is, can this position be sustainable? Will it pay for itself on normal debt collection that we'd be doing, which, based on the normal percentage, we're saying that there's at least net revenue, that there's, it pays for itself
Yes.
essentially,
Yes, definitely.
following
Yeah.
capturing all the debt
Yes.
collection. So
Yeah.
we can wait till next week about that. It doesn't sort of,
Okay.
it's not going to be a driving factor on this position. I'd just like to know what's in store for the following year.
Okay, sure.
And then two, Richard, you mentioned sort of you're on razor's edge on the revenue estimates. Where are you with the data? I know that at least on real estate revenues, you're sort of, you know what it is based on what Ryan, our assessor, has given you, that those numbers are known. But as I understood sort of where we're at this fiscal year is that the shift is going to be on BPOL, sales tax, meals tax, et cetera, all those other lines, which I think is what you mean, that you're on razor's edge.
That's correct.
Where are you as of today when you've looked at the numbers?
Um,
Are you
we
plus or
are-
minus?
We are running behind,
Okay,
but
So-
we have compared them to the 16 estimates, and we believe we're okay at this point. All right, there will be a shortfall. We anticipate a shortfall in 15, but the 16 estimates were built on adjusted 15s, not on the exact
I guess
15
to,
estimates.
to put clarity on what I'm asking for is from the time that you produced the budget, which would have been balanced, based on the revenue projections you had a couple, a month or two ago, or whenever that was, when you ran those numbers, have you rerun the revenue estimates to see where you're at, whether that delta has moved at all?
Yes.
Where does that
And
put you?
we are behind.
Which means right now, based on the numbers you know, we are behind, which means your
correct.
revenue stream is behind. By how much?
Between 400,000 and 600,000.
So right now, today, if I were to ask you, you've got a gap in your budget from the time you printed it. What was the number again?
400,000 to 600,000
400,000 to 600,000. Right now, today.
right now today.
That's from the FY15.
That's FY15.
Okay, and how about 16?
Like I said, we've adjusted the 16 based on where we were in December and January. As a matter of fact, up through February.
So on the current budget, given where you're at, where do you think you're going to get that money from? What's your plan?
Sure, I understand.
If you're
15.
talking about the FY15 shortfall, we are working on a process as to how we're going to reduce the budget to balance. It
Okay.
will involve cuts to departments, and we've had conversations with departments.
Okay. I need to think about how that plays out in this year's budget, but
Well, again, I will tell you that we've adjusted the 16 revenue forecast.
so
to-
bottom line is you're running $500,000 in deficit from the current budget that we're in.
Right,
That's sort of the bottom line,
yes,
that you're running a deficit right now.
yes.
Okay.
Other questions? I have one for you, and we'll let you go if you'd like, Ms. Costa. I think I've spoken with you, and then also you've done a memo. It seems like this net of 100,000 is actually at least somewhat below what you've either said verbally or in your memo. Is that right? Is that you've
Yes.
taken sort of a conservative number
Very
of
conservative.
I
$100,000?
was not going to put that first year number in there. Like I
That's-
said, the revenue estimates for 16 are already tight.
It's fine. I just want to clarify. I'm not arguing
I am
with you.
clarifying it for you.
Well, you're not really clarifying.
That's the number.
Well, that's what you've done. You're not really
Yes.
clarifying it. The fact is that you've taken a lower number,
I've taken a lower number.
and that's fine. I'm not necessarily complaining about that, but I want to make sure that's understood. That in fact, your number, it was higher than this, and they've taken a more conservative number, and that's,
Right.
I have no problem with that.
Right.
That's appropriate. But just so people kind of have an understanding of where this number came from,
Sure.
it was your estimate reduced by whatever, 10%, 20%, whatever it ended up being, to make it a more conservative number.
Right.
Okay. Is there any more questions for Ms. Costa while she's here?
Just in that same vein, and because we have talked about the investment pool number also, we're moving up from 12 to 15 million in the investment pool to take advantage of its slightly higher interest rates. At one point, we talked about more than 15 million, so that number too reflects a process of dialogue and compromise and consensus, and you've both agreeably landed on 15 million as a number that you're comfortable with, which
Right.
still, I'm not going to even ask you how many more millions that leaves, but it's a substantial number that we are going to keep in, ready cash. I mean, cash you can almost literally walk to the drawer and pull out to pay whatever today.
I mean, with LGIP and the checking account,
Yes.
those would be the other two vehicles for right now.
Okay.
If I could follow, I'm sorry, you got a question?
Yeah, I think it just goes,
conservative as always.
Mm-hmm. 1%. Mm-hmm.
And did we, well, let me ask Mr. Duncan a question. How much more money would be available in the Vaco BML account, assuming that, sure as we have a 2-week window to.
As you have assured us, you go a 2-week window to return these funds to liquidity. Is there another
We have about another 25 million. Right?
25
About
million?
40 million total.
So we have another
Maybe a little
20.
bit less than that now because we're coming up on the first real estate payment, but
Yes, yes. Not only that, but the 25 million is sitting in your checking account.
NLGIP, yeah.
Loses a percentage every year, so it's not just a basket it's sitting in, it's really a very leaky basket. And at 25 million sitting around, that's a lot of leakage, I would think. Could you help me by characterizing how much money the value of the money that we're not making available to us by just having it sitting around a checking account?
Well, it is earning something in LGIP. It's
less
just not,
than
it's less than the VIP
1%.
right now. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, it's more like
More like about
0.04.5 maybe?
I think it's a tenth of a percent,
The
isn't it?
10th of a
about a tenth of a
percent.
percent, yeah.
And what's the inflation rate currently?
Yeah.
We don't look at that, no. I see. I think that's all I have for you. Thank you.
Okay.
If I could just follow up on that line of questioning just a bit. So how much money do we have that's not in the, I guess is it VIP? Is that what you call the fund, the higher interest fund? How much is not in there? You said 25 million. You kind of nodded your head, Richard. What do you think the amount is that's in the lower interest vehicle?
I think it's closer to around 15, but she has the day-to-day.
And so it may it vary, or might it vary from 15 to 25, depending on when it is in the year?
Exactly.
So let me ask you
We're at
this.
the low end right now.
So let me ask you this. Would it be possible to do something where we put more in and get a letter of credit or line of credit so that if there is some kind of jam that we really need cash, that we can go ahead and have access to cash on that very rare instance where we might have some emergency, yet nonetheless, for the 99% of the time we don't have an emergency, we're getting a higher interest vehicle?
We are going to look at that, but initially, in our conversation, we talked about what our cash flows are. We know what our needs are going into the summer. We get as low as $4 or $5 million in August and September, and that's what I'm trying to guard against. It may be more because you have capital projects that are ongoing that we haven't borrowed money for yet. So, again, we're going to look at it. I'm saying conservatively that the initial deposit would be around 15 million. If we see that we have the excess cash, we'll be happy to have the conversation about putting more in.
I think the idea of having a safety net of a letter of credit or line of credit such that if you do end up in a cash crunch, you don't have to make poor decisions. You can just borrow money at hopefully fairly low interest rate for a carryover for that 2 weeks so you can pull your money out is something to consider. But I appreciate your conservatism. I think the spread is only going to get bigger over time as interest rates go up. You're not going to have 0.10, in other words, 0.1% versus 0.7%. I suspect in the next year or two, you're going to have 1 point whatever percent, and maybe even 2% as the longer term yields, which could actually really move the needle much more than what we're talking about today. And so I would just encourage you to consider, to keep your eye on that. And as time goes on, if we can find vehicles to mitigate risk, we should go ahead and consider those. I think it's going to be important to capture all the money we can
Yeah,
in that
and
vehicle.
we are.
We will.
We will.
Okay, did anyone else have any comments on that?
Just briefly on that, I trust your all's judgment and professional expertise on this. It might be helpful as we are facing a kind of soft environment maybe in the last quarter of this fiscal year, just have some idea, what the difference would be if we were able to invest a little bit more in the VIP. I don't think it's a lot of money. I mean, it's not all money is some money, but just some back of the envelope idea of what we're talking about here. But not right now, just something to provide to us later.
Mr. Baruch?
So I know that this was the subject of a pretty lengthy Budget and Finance Committee meeting about what the number should be, et cetera. And I know that there may be differing opinions about whether to use the this particular fund as a checking account or not, and I leave that up to the experts about how much liquidity we need and where that liquidity needs to be. But with what's being proposed, is it in both of your professional opinions that this leaves the city in a good place of being able to move money around as we need to and take in money as we need to, et cetera?
Yes.
Okay. And do we envision with this amount of money going into this fund that we're going to be using it as a checking account? Or is it going
No.
to be the
The
savings
longer
piece of
term.
it?
It's going to be a longer term.
It's like the savings account.
Okay, and I take it that the concern for that is about putting it in, say, putting all of the city's money in and really using it as, say, a money market or a money market type of account, which would pay more interest, but you could draw from it, is that there could be a rush by all jurisdictions to pulling that money out and the actual principals could tank. Is that sort of the negative side of that scenario of why we're not going that route?
What?
There's always that possibility, I guess.
And I'm not saying with what you are proposing,
Right.
it has that risk, but the risk of everybody pooling their money and everybody using this fund is everybody drawing large, even not all of it, but large sums of it could drive the market down for the yield, which would potentially lower principal if you stretch it out,
Right.
given how these instruments work, right?
Yes.
Yes.
That's why you're not recommending
Well,
putting in.
Right. My goal was to put money in at various terms and leave it there. And the reason why I wanted money to stay in LGIP is we'd never have to go into VML for any money.
I'm just trying to understand why you're not recommending that. And the reason for that is because of this drive that could potentially push the value down.
Yes.
Is that why?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
There is risk, yeah. The average duration is like 1.5 years on this investment on the VIP. So there is some risk, if, someone does pull out a large sum of money, they would, like I said, I've used the example of Fairfax, if they decided to pull out, a lot of money, a lot of their principal, and they had to sell investments in order to pay off Fairfax, Fairfax would take the loss on that, not the city. But if everyone decided, to do the same thing, then yeah, we could be affected.
So, just to kind of, but is there like a conversation amongst your peers not to put all of the counties or the city's money collectively into this pool because of that issue?
Yeah, just it's a risk, and that you want
So-
diversification.
So nobody's,
Nobody's put everything in. That's
it.
correct.
okay, and we're in line with how much other localities are putting in as far as a percentage?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, thank you.
If I could just ask one sort of related issue, we've got some money for long-term capital, not for, 2 years from now, but possibly 5 years from now or whatever. Are there any other vehicles that we can do to get a better long-term? Because the money's going to erode 5 years from now, 7 years from now. Money we sit in abeyance till then is going to lose value. Is there a vehicle, or if you're on the board of this group, right? I guess you will be once we join. Might I suggest that you speak with the idea of trying to get a longer-term vehicle so that we can get better returns on money that we might not use for 5 to 7 years that we're allocating for long-term capital?
Yeah, and we're looking at that, and different things that we might do with that longer term stuff. Even longer than VIP. So, and that is my goal, to get on the board for the VIP. You
Okay.
have to be voted on, so. But that's my goal, to get on.
Okay, because every year the value of money just sort of sitting there erodes, and so we really need to keep as much of that as we can,
Right.
inflation adjusted.
Agreed.
Who votes?
On the VIP board,
Yeah,
all the members.
all the current members get to vote, even though we're putting in money into the pool?
I'll get a, yeah,
Oh,
we'll get
you
a vote.
will get a vote, I
Yeah,
see.
once
Okay,
we're
so-
members, yeah,
So once you're a member, you
you get a vote.
I'm sorry, I may have missed this step. By putting in money, do we automatically get a seat at the table that's a voting membership?
You don't get to be on the board of directors.
I see.
So they have votes. And we we have a vote, but they have like 2 votes to our 1 vote, if that makes sense. Right.
Thank
So that's another reason why we want to get on the board, you know.
The treasurer will work to try to get on the board, but you have to be voted on.
And they have, I think, 2 seats that are dedicated to
Right.
smaller localities, so I think I have a good chance of getting on the board, so.
Any other questions for Ms. Acosta? Can we let her step away from the table? Thank you very much for all your hard work in this matter. Appreciate it. All right, other questions, comments, thoughts? Mr. Z?
Thank you, Mayor. Going back to page 2 and discussion about the transportation planner. Is there no incumbent currently that takes care of regional representation and traffic calming? I thought that was funded, and we had an incumbent there, and moreover, I thought we had hired 2 additional traffic type people to project manage, and so now we need another one. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, if I could, I'll start with the second part of Mr. Z's question. Council has approved 3 positions in the last 2 years for implementing CIP projects, specifically in the engineering and grant administration area. Those are fully funded by CIP and not out of local tax dollars, so it's helping us to move the project implementation forward at the engineering and construction management end. This position is a transportation planner that will supplement what Mr. Stoddard does as a transportation planner for the city. 50% of his time is transportation planning, and the other part is doing area plans and future planning. So he kind of complements the regional transportation piece and then the area planning and comp planning, transportation chapter, Rexham Park chapter. This position would basically mirror that so that you'd have a second 50% of a transportation planner, and at the end of the day, we will have 2 bodies making up 1 FTE that then can support the inside and outside of Route 66 projects, the MVTC, the MVTA, and the WMATA, all of the regional bodies, because one person simply can't get to all of those in a 50% part of his job. And so that's how we'll be able to leverage and have a better presence at the table for policies that will directly impact how much funding we'll get out of regional bodies for projects.
Thank you. I had no idea we had so much investment in transportation alphabet soup, but obviously we do. So am I to also understand by your presentation that Mr. Stoddard is moving gradually out of the transportation field into the larger area of strictly planning, so to speak? Have you added to his duties besides what I understand is his function, which is purely transportation?
The position, since he has been the incumbent, has not been fully transportation. When we changed over, when he first started with us, he was an intern and all he was doing was transportation, so most people knew him as the transportation planner. But with all the comp plan work and the area planning, he has been very involved in those planning projects that have some transportation, open space, neighborhood traffic calming, but the position has never been 100% transportation planner. And indeed, the former incumbent wasn't supposed to be, but over time, MVTA and MVTC took so much time when they first evolving that Ms. Block Sanford actually ended up doing a whole lot of transportation. The other part fell behind then. Council has strong work plan and strategic plan focus on both transportation, comp planning, area planning. And so he's been kind of juggling 50%, which means he's often not making it to the regional transportation meetings or not reviewing the agenda packets anymore to be able to give council a heads up on some of the key issues that the council members who are at these regional bodies would be expected to deal with.
Mr. Mayor, let me just add.
Of course.
There are a couple dynamics going on regionally that make a focus on the part of staff really important, and whether you agree to fund another position or not, it's up to the council. But first of all, there's real pressure to reallocate a lot of the funds to road projects in the western part of the region, and to take, frankly, I'll be honest about it, to take money away from the interjurisdictions. And the way that can be blocked most effectively is at the staff level. So there's a real need for, there's a lot of money involved, and we've got a lot of work that we need to do in terms of, you know, our transportation needs. And so the fight over the money is getting more and more competitive, if you will. In the old days, there was a kind of a win-win approach, but that attitude is rapidly slipping away. So we need somebody aggressively at the staff level advocating. The second point I would make is that the work here needs to be more and more, to get the big money, it needs to be a multi-jurisdictional effort, like the Route 7 effort, like the Route 66 effort. So that just takes a whole lot of staff time. There's just no substitute for that. So however the council wants to do it is a council decision, but the dynamics have changed, that if we're going to get our fair share, we're going to have to fight for it much more than we've had to in the past. So that's
what we got you as chair of the.
Well, yeah, and I don't mind doing it, but a lot of these decisions are really, frankly, made at the staff level, and that's why that intensive staff involvement is very important.
So let me jump in here because it is my question. So am I to understand, Mr. Vice Mayor, that you're the one responsible for ensuring that we have a transportation planner embedded in this very tight budget?
I think so. I think so, unless someone can tell me that the allocation of staff time with existing staff is not adequate or could be rearranged so that we don't need the additional time. But I think that the focus needs to be there, and it needs to be more than we've traditionally had to put on it.
Well, what I just heard from the assistant city manager is that the incumbent has had occasion to have mission creep. He's now doing much more straight planning work, and there's nothing wrong with that. I don't disagree with that. It's probably underutilized in the strict traffic sense, but you know, I just don't know that we need to have that currently. I mean, you know, you're the expert here. You represent us in all these regional boards and commissions that. I presume part of the purpose is to, one, ensure that we understand what's going on, and two, that there's money to be had that you would let us know, and we could react accordingly. And now you're telling us that we need to hire more staff to.
What I'm
get some
saying
money.
is we need more staff support on transportation.
I heard you loud and clear. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's certainly we're welcome to disagree with each other on that. But why now? Why, when the budget is so tight, are you insisting that we do that? And let me just add further, let me finish, not done yet. Let me also add further that given the difficult struggle we have this year, why are you insisting that we replace the police radios when we've heard time and again that the police are not requesting them? So I guess you speak for transportation and the police.
Yeah, well, let me talk about the police radios for a minute. As I understand it, I did in fact talk to the chief, and the chief said we need them. Number one. Number two, the current radios don't have all the capability that surrounding jurisdictions have. And we would be in a terrible situation of where surrounding jurisdictions had encrypted radios, ours weren't able to connect with them, and split seconds might be the difference between your life or some other constituents. So I don't think there's any question that we need to move forward on the police radios. I'd ask the city manager to discuss that. And the other question was raised was, is there a way to get more staff support on transportation other than hiring an additional person? So I turn both those questions over to you.
All right, on the radios, I would say just a couple things. One, of all the tools that the police department has, the radio is the most important tool. In the budget that I presented, I did not have funding for the radios. They need to be funded either this year or next year. So if they're not funded this year, I believe it will be critical that we fund it in FY17. If it is funded in either year, I believe we'll have to use debt to finance it. A 5-year debt term is a way to do that because we don't have the reserves to pay for it in cash. And so It really is a decision as to take this approach this year or next year. On the transportation planner, what has changed? We've always had between 0.25 and 0.5 of an FTE on transportation, and right now we're at 0.5. What has changed is at the regional level, there's a great deal more money and a great deal more decisions being made about the distribution of that money, and we have been struggling to keep up with that policy work and with those distributions. I think we do a good job for the resources that we have. I think we do an incredible job for the resources that we have. But if we are going to really be at the table for those regional meetings, we can't do it at the current level of staffing, I believe.
Well, you realize, Mr. City Manager, that this is different than what we started out with months ago. When you argue passionately that the radios could wait, and you gave us good reasons why they could, and transportation planner, kind of the same thing. So I'm just wondering where this goes, and yep, you're able to show us the remaining gap of about 0.75% on the tax rate for consideration. So, you know, I mean, who knows, if we're willing to forgo some of this stuff, that we could, you know, close the gap even further. We could all go home and vote on a zero tax rate increase. Thank you.
Ms. Oliver?
I just want to add that I think that I have in part been the squeaky wheel, Mr. Z, that has been asking that we look at how we might fund the transportation planner. I think this is really critical. Whenever we talk about change within the City of Falls Church, the issues that come up tend to be related to parking and traffic. We're in the middle of two parts. We're surrounded by counties that are putting increased traffic load on our municipality with the development at Tyson's and, you know, also Mosaic, and then Seven Corners with the plans that Fairfax County has. There is increasing pressure, as Vice Mayor Snyder says, on the western jurisdictions to divert all the funds to their roads. Not that long ago, one of the representatives wrote and said, listen, our vote should count more than Falls Church's vote. That's the kind of interjurisdictional bickering that's going on right now. I mean, he wrote this in an email, specifically, that his vote should count more than our vote. If we don't have staff that are addressing these critical issues, this is probably the single biggest part of the infrastructure of the entire United States, which is underfunded right now. And, you know, when funds are short, you know, you need to be at the table. And I think this is absolutely critical. I was one of, you know, I asked last year if we couldn't get more capacity here. And unfortunately, because we chose not to raise the tax rate, this couldn't be funded permanently. And we ended up in this position where we funded a slot, haven't filled it, and don't have funding going forward for what's absolutely critical. And you know, I don't want the tax rate to go up any more than anybody else does, but I think this is a very wise investment that we need to make in the future.
Mr. Brewer?
So just on the investment piece of it, so I hear loud and clear the issue of, you know, the interjurisdictional matters that are going on. So my focus is not per se on that. My focus rather is, you know, one of the comments that I'd raised before specifically about how we're planning on covering some of the WMATA money with MVTC money. And the response back I got, and I'm going to summarize here, is, well, we didn't have the staff bandwidth to really come up with projects, so we were in jeopardy of leaving money on the table because of staff bandwidth. Which to me wasn't a helpful answer, but that's what it was. So if we fund this position, why does that give us the bandwidth to do more projects that are in part funded by regional money or grant money. Because if I fund this, or if I agree to this, I don't want to hear next year that we left money on the table because we don't have bandwidth. Not only will you see smoke, but fire coming out of my head at that point. We'll have the water conversation about resource allocation plus 10.
Yeah, it'd be worth it just for that.
So, I just, because this is pretty, it's one FTE that creates bandwidth, I get it. And I'm not saying that we would absolutely get the money because of how the process works. But if we don't get the money, it shouldn't be for bandwidth, it should be because there's other better projects out there.
Well, the context of that comment before is that we have a great deal of state money that we've gotten in the last 5+ years, and our main focus of our efforts is to complete those projects and deliver value for the funds that we've already obtained. What I think is going on right now, though, is that the regional effort, this is a very fast-moving effort, and so we've got a half an FTE on it that's got other really important work it needs to do, and so we don't keep up with it all. And so I think that really is sort of the crux of the matter. That additional capacity, I do believe, will allow us to deliver projects more quickly for our community than is currently the case.
Would it also allow us to possibly do more projects or just more quickly in getting them done?
I think both.
Okay.
If I could just speak to this for a second, I mean, I see this position as dedicated, I don't know about substantially, but significantly to the regional meetings of the various bodies that have been referred to, NVTA, NVTC, the PPWA on the NVTA. I mean, there is a bewildering array of alphabet groups that are involved in the things that Ms. Oliver talks about. Now, Mr. Snyder is, he's got a day job and he's got a night job, and then he has these regional transportation jobs, and that's a lot of jobs, and no one can get to all of them. Ms. Oliver and I are his alternates on a couple of these things, and we can't get to them all. And there are times when we do not have staff to commit to these very important meetings where, as has been said, decisions are made about, millions of dollars. And so I hope at least that the emails that I get from Mr. Stoddard now, which are very good, very substantive, and sometimes conclude with, because of competing demands, staff can't make this meeting. And if that's a meeting that Mr. Snyder can't make, and that for whatever reason Ms. Oliver and I can't make, then Falls Church doesn't have a voice at that meeting. And so it may seem like just another meeting to some folks, but out in the community, but these things are very important. They have long-term implications for us, and there is potential for them to pay off. There's also potential for them to not yield much, but I think right now we have to err on the side of having a presence, having a voice, a member voice if we can, and a staff voice at all these meetings. And so for that reason, I would support this position.
If I could, I've got a couple questions, comments on this. One, I would certainly commend Mr. Stoddard, who was, I think, a nominee for Employee of the Year or a finalist for Employee of the Year. He's doing a great job, and I really hope we do all we can to keep him happy and with us for a long time. Following with Mr. Baruch's question, which I think I had some interest in as well previously, it sounded to me that getting more projects done was really more a function of project manager, construction manager, and not the job description that you've set forth down here at the bottom of this page. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say, except with the exception of, I think we will open up a little bit more capacity on the neighborhood traffic calming projects with this position.
Okay. But for the most part, as I read it, it's really supporting these larger regional meetings that we all go to plenty of. Would you think it is reasonable to have an expectation that this person would actually help us bring in more money to the city? I mean, that sort of seemed to be the idea, that we would have bigger seat at the table and be able to collect more regional funds for Falls Church. Is that a reasonable expectation, Vice Mayor Snyder?
It is, because a lot of the work is done with staff meetings that occur separate and apart from the ultimate board meetings. So frankly, a lot of decisions, a lot of compromises are made, and if you're not at the table, your interests are just not going to be pursued. So it's not like we're paying him to attend the same meeting I'm attending. We're paying the person to do the legwork in the staff meetings where a lot of the compromises are really being made. And then additional support on these larger issues to push back against efforts to reallocate funds away from the interjurisdictions.
So it may be, in fact, that this employee could be paid for with additional monies that we might receive that we might not.
I think that's highly possible, yeah.
Okay.
In the budget that's before you, part of the position would be funded with CIP projects. It's a
Oh.
multi-funding source, not just local tax dollar.
And what percentage of that is, I missed that, what is the percentage of the proposals funded by
The
non-operating?
current estimate is 20%, and we're also charging some of Mr. Starter's current position to CIP.
And I wonder if another option for consideration would be, instead of doing a full-time FTE, is to do half-time or something like that, like sort of a partial number as a starter to see whether that works, whether that's productive, and then figure out what to do as time goes on. In other words, not have a full-time person or allocate someone partly to one thing, partly to something else.
I just want to point out that those emails that Mr. Duncan mentioned that Mr. Stoddard is sending, he is frequently sending them at 11 or 11:30 at night. So I already think that he's working a lot more than a full-time position.
But him, he's already here. You're talking about adding a second person.
Right,
I'm
but
not sure
that
he's
would
working
also-
2 full-time positions. I mean, maybe he's
I'm-
working 1.5.
I'm just, okay, but I think that if he's working more than a full-time position, there's more than a part-time position to pick up workload.
Okay, well, go ahead.
And just one thing I would note is that the way that we have thought of funding this position through the carry forward and through the use of CIP and things like that, if they're redeployed, they don't really work towards closing the gap. So if this position is cut out, it doesn't really affect that $340,000 gap. I just put that out there as.
All right, that's a fair point. So I think some of us, or I think all of us, are working as hard as we can to close that gap. Mr. Z?
Okay, so let's talk about the gap. Now, in the general government box at the top, you're proposing a change of 308.5K, representing 0.9% to the proposed budget from last year, and more importantly than the school transfer is a request of a little over $1.5 million, which represents a 4.3% change. So we get down to the gap. Is it my reading of this budget, after you've taken all the credit for the health plan changes, moving the school bus over to our side, funding the school campus planning from the 85% of the water funds, and I don't know what else we're doing here, that this amount, as it remains unchanged by any revenue collections, could be 180, could be 200, could be 150, I understand what you're saying there, or investment returns, that the $341,000 would come out of the $1.5 million the school is requesting? Or am I misreading this?
Could you ask the question again?
Remaining gap.
Remaining gap. Who eats the gap?
Well, there's a gap, and so part of the discussion is where the remaining gap comes from, or how that is closed. And so, in terms of the ratios you noted at the top, the 0.9% growth in the general government, that is where we are right now with the healthcare savings on the general government and the school side, the 4.3 also. That's kind of where we are right now with a $943,000 gap. If the remaining gap was closed through a reduction in the school transfer increase, then the increase would be approximately just over 1.2 million and would be about a 3.1% increase.
So how's the 3.1 increase compared to what the request is from the school? Can you refresh my memory again with regard to the teacher catch-up?
Well, I don't know exactly how it all breaks out, but in terms of...
It was 5.3% request increase.
Yeah, so in the budget that I presented on March 8th, it was the transfer increase was 5.3%. Now it's at 4.3 with removal of the healthcare costs and the bus. If the 340,000 was taken from the school transfer, then the result would be a 3.1% increase in the transfer.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Burke?
So, just going down the list of expenditure changes, and I'm glad that you're listing them as expenditure changes, not as cuts, because the only cut that's there is the $25K for catch, right?
That's an increase.
That's an increase. Oh yes, it's not in parens. Got it. Okay, never mind. I take that back. So, in what you're proposing, there are no cuts per se. They're sort of being pushed off to future years.
The school campus planning is one that is a one-time expenditure, and so that is the typical use of one-time funds for capital reserves.
That's not what I'm asking.
But the others would be reductions in expenditures in the current year, but they would need to be addressed in FY17.
Okay. So everything that's just so I'm clear on this. So as far as true, like, cutting reductions in spending, it's those top line items, which are the healthcare plans, which, I think are great that those savings were found.
Mm-hmm.
So staff should be, commended on rebidding those. The school bus is sort of not a cut per se, but it's debt finance, so it moves to another book.
Mm.
And the rest of the items, just so the public is aware, are moving towards either use of one-time money, which means other stuff isn't being used for one time, or they're going to limit our ability to debt finance, or we're going to pay for it later on, specifically the $305,000, which we know we're going to have to take bonds for, so that just upticks whatever bond borrowing we were going to do next year. So let's just be clear about what's going on to close this gap. It's just getting pushed to next year minus the $600,000 in savings. Is that sort of fair about where we're at?
Well, there's 340,000 at the bottom.
No.
Which would be a reduction in the school transfer.
Well, I'm not on that right now. I'm talking about before that line.
Well, I think there's also money that was mentioned as to the city budget where you found additional savings, unless I misheard
counted for that.
No, but above and beyond the healthcare. In other words, your original request is for 1.5%, correct? And now it's down to 0.9. So that's 0.6 reduction in the city requested budget. Is that correct?
Right, but that's the healthcare.
It's purely healthcare.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the other reduction was not necessarily a reduction in the ask, but a reduction nonetheless based on the expenditure, the revenue that was coming in below. In other words, you mentioned earlier, the city also saw it or found $400,000 to $600,000. I believe you're asking budget department heads, et cetera, to come up with savings as well. Is that right? Did I mishear that?
For FY15.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So if I can just kind of finish my train of thought. So basically, you've managed to find $600,000 in what I'll label as true cuts with the healthcare, which are kind of gone off the books. They're not going to show up next year. And then everything else that's an expenditure change is really moving towards next year as far as what's happening with this year's budget. So you're paying for it next year and the years beyond that. Is that my understanding that correctly?
I think as a general statement, I would just say the revenue collections, we've discussed that one. The investment returns, that's going to change from year to year based on interest rates. That one may be sustainable or it may not based on interest rates.
But the others, no. So you're either utilizing one-time money or you're pushing it off to next year.
That's right.
Okay. Now, you're also having to deal with the gap from fiscal year 15. So I want to talk about that for a second. So you said about $500,000 right there.
Yes.
Okay. And you know, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I don't think we can talk about budgets in 1 year timeframes. What are you thinking about cutting? Do you have a sense of that? And I'm not looking at line items. What types of things that have visibility are you looking at cutting right now? Because that's pretty significant. That's $500,000. That's, depending on how big it is, it's 1 or 2 cents. How are you guys getting there?
We're still working that out.
Items under consideration. There's money from HHS where we figure we'll have some underspending. We are going to look at the road paving. We may not do that this year, or we may try to use an alternative
I'm going to
form.
pause you right there. So that 1.6 million that already got cut out of the budget now is going to grow.
Well, let me just, the paving, we would, the only thing that we're really talking about in paving is whether we would do a debt financing for paving in order to do 2 things. One, potentially not have operating funds for paving in the current year FY15, but also on a one-time basis increase the amount of funding for paving through debt. But we're
Okay.
just exploring that as
So
an
one
option.
exploratory option is cutting that identified unmet need and making that unmet need possibly bigger.
Not
right?
in FY16, but just as
As we move forward.
one item for FY15.
What else?
We have some vacancy savings.
Before you,
Yes.
can you characterize the amount that would be available by removing paving from operation?
300,000.
Yeah, so that's what we have in the FY16 budget. That's what we have in the FY15 budget.
Thanks, Dan. I mean, that, just while we're trying to put a finer point on that, what does that mean? What does that translate into, roughly? How much aren't you getting done? Or
Well, we
potentially
would,
gonna not get done?
what we would propose, and we're still working these proposals out, but we would do the work, but we would debt finance it as opposed to using cash. We have, as part of the transition in our IT department from contracted to in-house, there were some one-time savings, and so that's one area that we think we'll be able to use to close the FY15 gap. That's a start of beginning to close that gap.
Thanks.
We
then-
identified about $500,000.
And this is as a result of BPOL, meals, sales, everything other than.
Personal property and BPOL are your loss leaders at this point. And in addition, we have a reduction in recordation taxes that we're aware of, and that's what's making up the bulk of the gap.
And you've translated that into the current budget as far as your forecasts go.
Yes,
Have you looked at the numbers more recently?
yes.
As of when?
Thursday?
And your projections haven't changed for this, for the 16 budget?
No.
Mr. Duncan?
Could I just shift for a second to a question? If the numbers that are shown here ended up as where we landed, in other words, we found a way to close the remaining gap, the budget that we would pass would show unassigned fund balance percentage of approximately what at the end of the day?
A little under 17.
Okay, so the unassigned fund balance would still be on the high end of our policy range of 12 to 17% if we approved the budget sort of as it's laid out here.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, of course, Ms. Conley?
We talked about planning a little bit, and I just want to explore a little more the $100,000 that came out from school campus planning and how we're actually going to pay for that, because we are doing school campus planning right now, and we know we're going to have some expenses next year. So why would we not put that into the CIP or into the operating budget? And how can we get that in there?
Well, the council could put it into the budget that you adopt on the 27th, but where we are right now is we have $150,000 unexpended from the CIP in FY15. And we also have decisions to make in terms of the scope of work for the planning work that we'll do in FY16, and that's not resolved yet. And so an option would be to get that resolved, and then with that clear picture as to what the cost will be in FY16, then make a budget amendment to fund it.
And the other option would be to
The other
allocate
option would be-
200,000 or 250,000 now,
The
put it
other
in the
option would be
CIP.
to pick a number and put it into the CIP. In either event, where I believe the source of funding will need to be is from the 85% share of the water sale
Right.
proceeds, which are
Right,
which are
and that
sitting
makes
in,
sense
in
with-
capital reserve.
Right, because the property came from the water sale, so that makes sense to tie those two together. I would just like to say that I think we should put some money in there now. I think that because we're working on the project and we know that there's going to be something happening in July, we should have some money there to plan it without having to do a budget amendment in September.
You're going to have to do one anyway.
There will be budget amendments that are coming along sort of
Right.
regularly through the fiscal year, and so we would just tag it into one of those budget amendments. But I think either way is a fine decision.
Okay.
So any thoughts on that, Mr. Burke? You seem to want to speak. Do you have a comments, question on that?
I mean, I don't have a preference for it. I think the most transparent way to do it is we know it's coming, we don't know the figure, but that's a lot of things with budgeting, so I'd rather sort of see it in the budget. As far as waiting for a budget amendment, I think that leaves one binary choice about what to do, because there ain't going to be a Christmas tree where all of a sudden we're going to have a surplus to find $100,000 midstream, mid-year, unless you've
Well,
underspent.
the only reason why
Well,
we're saying.
let me finish.
Sorry.
Whereas putting it in the budget now, at least there could be theoretically a discussion of how it's paid for, whether it's one-time sales proceeds, which makes sense one way to go, or pulling in from the tax rate, which may be another way to go. At least it gives you that option. I'm not proposing one option or the other, just saying that one sort of drives towards a particular way of having to finance it, and another gives you more flexibility of what we do. So I'd rather see it rather than sort of dealing with it later knowing it's coming, and take our best estimate of what we think it is.
Okay.
Sorry, I think Richard was going to say something.
Yes, Richard.
No, no reason, no need.
Sure.
Yes.
I already covered it.
Yes, Mr. Baruch said best estimate.
Okay. Okay.
Actually, what I meant, Richard, is your exact estimate.
As of when?
Yeah.
As of Thursday. Actually, it's in the eight ball, or and you shake it up and see what it is. Actually,
Ms. Conley?
I just have some questions about the WMATA reduction. You mentioned that in the future, we would not be able to match this money?
Well, we have a match in FY16 that we know.
And what is the match?
The match is that $1.4 million required WMATA capital contribution. So that's our match.
Okay.
And that's a one-time thing, and so in FY17, we don't know what our match would be, and therefore, we would not have a vehicle by which to use NVTA funds for our WMATA costs.
What could our match be? That's the kind of thing that Mr. Baruch is talking about, the projects that we...
Right. Well, this is really driven by WMATA's capital program, and so we know that train is coming.
Literally.
And that's kind of the opportunity to take advantage of in FY16, and that we don't think it's going to be there in 17. And so, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that we're talking about putting the full NVTA allocation into the NVTC trust to meet our WMATA expenditures, because those expenditures are going up. They're going to be about $700,000 per year. And so that actually is a fairly significant issue that we'll need to address in FY17 is to meet that ongoing WMATA obligation, which we think will be about $700,000 a year of local support without that NVTA money. So that's sort of a one-year prop, and next year we'll need to fund it with local funds.
So how much will we need next year?
I believe 700,000.
700,000.
You done, Ms.
Now,
Conley?
that could get better if gas prices go up. That you never you never hope for that, but that is one of the big reasons why our local contribution is needing to go up, is because those revenues have gone down, in addition to WMATA costs going up in general.
And we'll be continuing to work with WMATA as they develop their capital program, so it's prudent and meets the needs, but it can be more evenly budgeted out.
Mr. Baruch?
So it's getting, it's getting to, really the time frame when we're going to have to make some decisions. So, I'll make the same ask that I made last Monday. And budgets are about competing interests. And I know that some members of the council were really pushing towards keeping a flat tax rate. And I'd ask that at least we get some heads up of where proposed cuts are going to come from. So, we've come to, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but sort of ways of moving expenditures around and pushing them towards next year. I'll call them gimmicks. And some true savings with healthcare. So that still leaves $340K or $341K. So for the members who have been pushing for the flat tax rate, can you just let us know so we at least have some time to think about it? And I asked this last week, that if we can sort of get a heads up about where the proposed cuts were going to come from for those members who were pushing in that direction. And now we're at 10:45, and I specifically asked for that just so we could have a robust discussion about it. And I've gotten nothing.
Oh,
Mr. Duncan, sure.
thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do note the hour's late, and before people doze off, I hope I don't cause them to doze off. I just want to thank the manager and the staff for working with all of us, because we all have competing priorities and interests, to try to address them, just as the community has many competing priorities and interests. It's very appropriate that we drill down into the details and haggle over $100,000, because that's that brings us a better final product, I think. It's also important to, I think, step back and look at what this budget does from a broader perspective. I won't go over that tonight, but I would like us, I would hope, I would ask, I guess, that this council try to get itself in a position to allow staff to spend the rest of this week kind of preparing the story of the budget that we will pass on Monday, so that the community understands all its elements. I'm going to argue that there are very many good elements that are included in this budget, and I would hope that they would be paid proper attention. The investments that we've made that hardly any other jurisdiction in America would make, and our pension fund and other decisions that we've made, the water money, we're touching a fairly small percentage of that. We're keeping the unassigned fund balance at the top of the policy range. A lot of good high-level things that we're doing in this budget that I think it's important for the community to understand. That does land us, as your numbers show, with a scenario that would enable the city side to grow 0.9%. I would credit individuals such as the treasurer for coming up with ways to enhance revenues. You read a lot in the local press, blogs about, are they really working hard enough to scrub this budget? Are they looking for efficiencies? Are they looking for new ways to do things? And I think this budget represents that as well. I would characterize those as positive steps that we're taking, not portray them negatively, but I'd like to have Mr. Briggs' final vote on this, so I want to make sure to be careful about how I speak in that regard. The gap, of 340,000 would, as I said, entail the city side growing by 0.9%. It would enable the school side to grow, if we look at the chart on page 3, the second line on the right, by $1.128 million. So increase of 3.1%.
The city side would grow by 1.2%, not by 0.9%.
So
Is that accurate, Mr. Shields?
Yeah, the, where we are right now is at 0.9%, but on the expenditure side, we would be adding the treasurer position as a term
Gotcha.
position, the catch, and the volunteers.
I got you. So
with that change, it'd be
1.2
going to
versus
1.2.
3.1%.
but the treasurer position is compensated for to a certain percent by the revenues that it's going to bring in, right?
Yeah, but just showing it strictly on the expenditure
Okay,
side,
well-
that's why it drives that number
I
up.
understand. So expenditure revenue. So there's thanks for the slight clarification there, Mr. Kimball. At any rate, more than a $1.1 million increase on the school side, of 3.1%. I suppose that I'm one of the folks who Mr. Brook refers to, so I will certainly say that I'm very interested in keeping the tax rate level. I think it sends an important signal to the community that we have scrubbed this budget very hard, that we have made some tough decisions about things that we cannot fund. We have made some decisions about how to finance things that we do want. And I think it's entirely appropriate when we do want a lot of things. We want transportation planners, and we want police radios, and we want all the things that are listed there, that we, fund some of those things through borrowing, just as a regular household would do, and pay the debt finance just as a regular household would do. So if the numbers that you've presented us with here would land us with a level tax rate, I would support the framework that you outline here, and I believe in a year when school enrollment growth was, I believe, less than 2% or thereabouts, and inflation has been 2 or less. We are providing a very robust operating budget for the schools, and at the same time pursuing an extremely aggressive capital campaign. We built Thackeray, we built Mount Daniel, we're building Mount Daniel, we're planning for the high school. I would just put it out to the community, the question, does this seem like a balanced approach to the whole community's needs? The schools are the crown jewel of the community. There's no question about that. I'm, have worked with and for the schools for many decades here in the city. And at the same time, we need a crown to hold the jewel, and the community is the crown. And I think it's very important that we send the signal to the whole community that we're all in this together. And I believe the city side has shown, restraint within mandates of, growth that we need to do. And I think the schools have basically done, a very fine job too. We're simply asking if $1.1 million would be sufficient in a year when we know things are tough, and we do have hopes of better days ahead. The plans that we make for the future have to take into account the ARC contribution, which is not factored into this budget. If we were, resorting to sneaky tactics, we would try to pull some of that in. We're not. That remains for next year to benefit to the tune of 2 cents. There are other, levers that we could pull that we're not pulling. And then, of course, there's the revenues to be generated by Rushmark and Lincoln when they open, which I do believe whoever sits here a year from now will benefit significantly from. I would like to get this budget behind us and get about the business of earning some more money. I think we need to devote our energy and time this summer to some of the development projects that are before us, because there are multiple ways to generate the revenues that we need to run the community. One way is to tax, another way is to earn. And I think we need to keep a balance between those two approaches.
Thank you, Mr. Z.
Thank you for that eloquence, Mr. Duncan. I have struggled with my perspectives on this budget, and so it just really comes down to a gap here of probably less than 1 cent of tax rate. And perhaps that's how it will end up being voted on this coming Monday, a week from now. But let me just say that with everything that we've seen, all the movement that has occurred on the budget, and there are reasonable people on council that have reasonable objectives, and all that goes to, unfortunately, helping to create the budget gap that we have. I think we're close, and if it helps the city and the school to spend this following week looking at options and creative options to look at their expenditures, then I would be one in favor of holding the tax rate flat. I've seen so many people this year come out. In the past, we've heard people say, fully support the school budget, and we have heard from people that write and say, don't increase my taxes. And now a third group has emerged to say, I've got kids in the school here, and please don't increase my taxes. That's a brand new class of people. And I have to also reflect that the 6 or 7 town hall meetings, the various structures that be held, and chambers and the community center, taking online surveys, have been met with a general positive responses. And when you ask them why, they say, well, you guys are just going to jack up my taxes. I need to spend my time and energy selling my house, cashing out, and leaving. So to those people I say, please stay. We're going to try to do what we can to keep our taxes as fair and for this year as flat as possible. Thank you.
Other comments? You don't have to if you don't want to, but anyone else have anything to say? Okay. Did you want to say something, Mr. Burke?
Not a comment, but this goes to the point that I was making earlier, and it's similar to the points that I made before about what I termed as sort of budget movement into out years. I mean, we saw this by the majority of the council, which I was not a part of utilizing monies to essentially buy down, if you will, the tax rate last year, and it shows up in this year's budget. And we're about to do it again, similarly, but utilizing other avenues to sort of push off things to next year. So it's roughly, $500,000 that would be getting not utilized or pushed to next year. And I'm not making a judgment about whether it should be done or not. But there's got to be a plan at some point where we don't push off and we start figuring it out and we start looking at multi-years. And I know that Mr. Duncan is going to turn to economic development, which is certainly part of that. And I absolutely agree with that. But we're already hearing that we're looking at a deficit in the current fiscal year of, roughly 500,000. And then we're just pushing off additional sort of levers for next year to be dealt with. And maybe that's the route that we go. Maybe I get behind it. But to sort of just say we've closed the gap, let's all go home, and not think about, and I'm not suggesting that members are doing that, but not focus in on, hey, we've created a hole starting next year, I don't think would be wise. And again, I'm not suggesting that I don't think that's the way to go, or it's a way to go for some of the reasons that Mr. Z is contemplating. But I'm going to be focusing in on how are we going to deal with next year. And Mr. Duncan, again, I support you on the economic development piece, not in the same strategy that you have, but certainly that's part of the equation. But we do need to sort of take a light of that and not just say we're done. And I'm not suggesting that anybody's saying that, but as we go build the process. And this isn't the only thing in the budget that's happening as far as next year money. That's a way underestimated number, because I think as I went through it, there was WMATA money. I mean, there's probably over $1 million of money that's sort of going to come up next year in a gap. So what I would ask is if you can sort of take all those things that are here before us now and are going to show up in next year and the following years, and I think some of them were things like WMATA. I think I went through a list of them at one of the meetings, and it's getting pretty late, and I can't recall what those were. But do you know which items I'm referring to, Wyatt?
Are you referring to the things that are issues that we will have to deal with in FY17? Is that, I'm
Correct.
sorry.
Correct.
Yeah.
So if we take these actions, there's about $500,000 worth of money that it's either one-time money or just gets put off to future years. And then there's things that are already baked into the budget that you proposed that show up in future years. So what I'd like to see is a listing of all those and how they show up in next year's budget, if that makes sense, in 17. Just so we've got a document to say, this is the problem that we're going to have to tackle next year, and there are certain tools that we have to deal with it. Some of it's going to be on additional revenues that are going to be natural growth in the city, hopefully with assessments. The other is going to be economic development, et cetera. But I think it's important to have that document along with whatever budget we pass. And again, that's not to place value judgment, that's just to take stock of what we're actually doing.
I would just, if I could, I would agree with Mr. Baruch's request there, and certainly agree with the need for a long-term view of our obligations and potential. Mr. Ocondre and I talked about that in terms of our small area plans. What is the revenue potential of the planning effort that we've undertaken over the last several years? I think we're beginning to see some of that realized as soon as next year, and I think we see some of it beginning to show its face in the discussions about the Upper West Side land where the high school is. I think it's very important to include the schools in this conversation because, as I mentioned last week, the formula for success that the community, the formula that the community used to success before when Maryland Henderson had to be built was that ambitious investments in capital infrastructure, the middle school, were accompanied with restraint in operating spending for several years so that the community could digest that substantial commitment and remain whole as a community. Again, I emphasize that because I think it's just very important, as Mr. Z said, to realize that there are people on different points in their lives, and to the degree that we can craft a budget and a CIP that tries to respond to as many of those concerns as we can, I think it's important to do so.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Snyder.
Sure, thanks a lot. I too would like to close this gap, and I'd like to have our managers for both the schools and, of course, the school board and the city manager work together to come up with some proposals that we can look at, hopefully before we meet again, with some ideas about how we can do that. And I would certainly like to get there. But I'll tell you, there is one thing that I will not allow to happen, which is that I will not sacrifice the quality of the reasons why we have government in the first place. And that is public safety in the schools and the other essential services. So whatever the budget is that we end up with, whatever the cost, there's one thing worse than high taxes, and that's a government that doesn't function and do what it's supposed to do, what it was created to do. And finding the right balance is something that we're all engaged in. There's been a lot of great input from folks. I've read it all, respect it all, and we'll do our very best. But I'm not gonna, I need to be satisfied that the budget that we fund this year, as in prior years, will assure the quality of our schools and will assure the quality of our basic services. This country is littered with governments that have played fast and loose, and we have the kind of failing infrastructure that we have, that we see all across this country. And as long as I'm in this position, I'm not going to let that happen in the City of Falls Church. So all that said, I'm with those who want to try to get us to a level tax rate. And I'll commit to work very, very hard with the schools and with our management to see what else we can do to get there. But ultimately, I'm not about to sacrifice the quality of what this government does in the process. Thanks.
Any other comments? You don't have to make a comment if you don't want to. Ms. Conley?
I'll just say a little thing here, which is that I am so impressed that we're down to $340,000. That was a big gap that has been closed, and as Mr. Berwick said, some of it has been cuts and some of it has been creative financing and looking at things differently. So thank you to everyone who has done that. I think the health insurance thing was huge and took a lot of work in a fast time, and all of this has taken a lot of work in a fast time. So thank you all for that. Like Mr. Snyder, I do not want to sacrifice the quality of our government and our schools. And my question is, $341,000 is how much? How many cents?
Less than one.
Less than 1 cent.
0.91 cents.
0.91 cents. That's close. That's really close. That's really close. So thank you for all that. And I think that's all I'm going to say right now.
0.91176.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Could you recalculate that again, please, Mr. Z?
No,
If we just round it up, maybe I think we'll be all squared away right now.
look like pie.
I would just conclude maybe with, unless there's anyone else who wants to speak, that this is a shell of a budget that I can support. I think you've done some great work, city manager and also our school superintendent, to get us where we are right now, and I want to thank you for that. As I've said for a pretty good while, I think we need to live within our means. And I think we're getting to where we need to be on this, and flat tax is where I've said I want to be, and I think we're getting very close right now, so I'm very pleased with the hard work that's been done. And unless there's anything else in this, why don't we go ahead, and is there any comments we need to, council comments, council scheduling items? What's that? I'm sorry, Mr. Shields?
Well, we do need to prepare budget documents. You know, one of the sort of the basic things of budget adoption night is that any changes at the dais have rippling effects through all the numbers in the ordinance that's before you. And so it's important that we can prepare options, but I think it's important that tonight we leave with clarity as to what those options are so that there's minimal changes at the dais.
Well, I would suggest one option is essentially what this document can represent, which is the various savings and a gap, this 340 as a reduction. And so I think this first page can be at least one.
But reduction from where?
The school budget,
Okay.
as we've discussed. There could be another option without this gap. In other words, if someone wants to see that as a tax increase of 0.91 cents or round it up probably to a penny, we can do that as well.
Mr. Mayor, I think that's the wrong approach, if I might add. I think a better approach is to say we would like our managers and the school board to work with us to come up with a mutually agreeable way to close the gap. And I don't want to go in there with, oh yeah, let's make a political statement one way or the other. I want to get a budget that does the job. So I want to know if we are able to close this gap, which I think we'd all like to do, right? And I certainly am one of them. I want to know what's the effect of doing that and what is the best way to do it.
Well, I think in some ways, I don't know if the city manager is in a position to do that. I mean, that's really, I think that's our job, to come up with the ways we want to see. I mean, there's certainly options that can be presented. I think we're looking at one of them right now. But I'm not sure that's your role. I mean, you could comment, Mr. Shields, if you'd like. I mean, it'd be great if you and the school superintendent can work out our budget for us, but I'm not sure that would be, anyway, why don't you comment as to how?
Well, I think that is, that would be difficult for us to do. And I think it would be also difficult for the superintendent to make agreements on any reductions after the school board has acted. I don't want to speak for the superintendent, but I think that would be, difficult.
So,
And certainly we can have discussions with,
so the proposal is that we close this gap on the backs of the schools. Is that the proposal?
Well,
That's what I've heard so far. What I want to hear is more constructive approach than that.
well, propose it then. I mean, you're certainly welcome to make a proposal.
You know what? I'm willing to go with the 1 cent if I
Okay.
have to,
All right.
unless I hear a better way to get there than I've heard so far. So you all have proposed it. What you're proposing is you're going to close the gap with a $340,000 cut in the school budget. Is that what I'm hearing?
No, the gap is this whole page is closed by this gap, including giving the schools 99% of what they've requested.
Right. So you're proposing that we're going to cut the schools $340,000. Is that your proposal?
This proposal will actually give 99% of what the
Right,
school
but you're going to
requested.
cut them, in order to close the gap, you're going to cut the schools $340,000.
And your proposal is to fully fund the schools and raise taxes by a penny.
I think my proposal is that I would like to get to that lower amount, and I'd like some more discussion about the other ways to get there, if we can.
We can, but I mean, we're
But
meeting
if you want
today.
to propose that as an option, you go right ahead, Mr. Mayor. It's hardly leadership.
Well, I think there is a proposal on the table, and you have, it sounds like a separate one, which
So
is to
your
raise taxes a
proposal,
penny.
your proposal is to cut the schools $340,000 in
I
order
don't-
to
it's not
reach
a- it's
an
not a cut.
artificial amount that
It
you've
is,
set.
it is to fund the schools 99% of what they've requested, giving them 3.1%
Okay,
increase.
go ahead and propose it.
Well,
Mr. Mayor, if I
yes.
might, you guys are having so much fun. I'm perfectly happy to, if we need to advance the process, do what I think we're being asked to do. I mean, transparency in this process is important. That's why we're here tonight with what I recollect is the most detailed kind of, list of options that I can remember in the time that I've served on council about how to close the gap. The city has expended considerable effort to get us where we are today. If they expended any more, it seems likely that some folks would have trouble supporting it because they would say there were gimmicks in it. But, I don't want to say there's no more potential for movement here, but I think we have to be realistic that this is something that we have been talking about since at least, in my case, last summer, that there needed to be restraint in operating spending on both sides, the city and the schools. When I stood up before a group of people at the Mount Daniel Referendum Forum and said, I'm supporting the Mount Daniel referendum and it will not have an impact on your tax rate as long as the schools agree to restrain in operating spending, everybody thought, hey, you're a great guy. That restraint number has fluctuated a bit over the months as the economy has not maybe performed as handsomely as we thought that it might. But the number that's represented here is certainly within range, I think, of what we have been talking about, the 3.1% number. It does represent a $1.1 million increase in funding for our schools. No one would do anything here to diminish the quality of our schools or put the quality of our services in the city at risk. That is 99%, as the mayor said. If it is for procedural purposes necessary for someone to propose a budget along the parameters that are listed on this paper, I, as the chair of the Budget Committee, will do that. I did not seek the chair of the Budget Committee. I assumed that more senior members would want it, but perhaps they had more sense than I did, and so here I am. I have done my level best to try to bring this process to the point where it is now, where people have real choices with real numbers that we can debate and have debated. It is what it is. There is a gap of $341,000 that it is our duty to try to close, not, I think, to ask staff to huddle up and, by hook or crook, come up with more suggestions to us. I think the time is now for us to at least have a proposal on the table that members can debate and discuss, and if other ideas come forward in the next week, there's nothing wrong with that. But as you say, the staff needs to be able to prepare some documents, and I, again, return to what I said, which is I think we surely would all agree that it would be tragic if the headlines in the newspaper are about, dissenting council, haggles over, 1% of the city budget, rather than tell a story about all the good things we're doing to move our community forward in this budget. I've seen the bad side of that happen so many times here. I resolved that if I ever had a chance to try to tell a story in a more positive way, I would do it. And so I guess I'm making a small effort to try to do that by bringing some procedural clarity, so that's what I would propose.
So we would prepare an ordinance on this basis. We can prepare another ordinance that has the reductions with the remaining $340,000 gap. I think I've heard those two discussed, and that would have an increase in the tax rate. So those are two issues. One other ones that I think would be good to resolve is whether to put funding in the CIP for the campus planning study, and what the school board requested back in I think in December in their adopted CIP was $250,000. That could be a placeholder number and put that into the budget and fund that with capital reserves, and then we can revisit that once the scope is finished up. But I think that would be helpful to have that as whether that's in or whether that's out for our budget ordinances.
I vote for in. And my question is, if we put $250,000 in the CIP and we do not spend it all next year, what happens to that money?
It stays in the CIP and it has a term of 3 years. And so we would track it, one thing that's, when it's in the CIP, it's very visible for both the school board and for the city council, and we can keep a very close eye on it.
Just on that point, if we're going point by point, which I think is a fair way to go at this point, I would support it. I'm not necessarily, thrilled with the funding source, but I think it makes sense, and it's, part of it goes against my sort of notion of not using one-time money for something that's quasi one-time, but I think it fits the bill of being a one-time issue, and the money did come from the transactions dealing with the water sale, so I'd be supportive of using the water proceeds in part to pay for that. I don't know if the number is 250, just so it's clear, no matter how I vote on the budget, that I hope it's not that high, but if that's the placeholder.
Your number.
It's what I'm getting at is there should be a footnote to that's based on what we know right now, but there are other ongoing discussions about what that number should be, if any at all. So if there's a way of putting that into the whereases or somewhere within the document or the staff report, that would be helpful if we're trying to track it. That nobody's saying this is a definite, you've got the money because of these ongoing issues. Is that, Mary Beth, does that, since you and I did them, so I think that would be something I could support. And just while we're on sort of the budget notions, and I'm not necessarily saying I support this, but if we're talking about having options on the table, I think with what I labeled as sort of the one-time monies and movement of money from one year to another should be laid out, and having the tax rate support that. Not that I would favor that approach, but would want to see that out there and laid out of this is what the true budget, if we were not sort of doing these movements, what it would look like and what it would take. And again, I would be doing that for transparency, along with the document that shows that if it is moved, what the total bill is that we're talking about when you add up all the items. And what I'm talking about, Wyatt, if you guys are looking at it, is roughly the 500,000 that's here.
Yeah, understood.
And again, to my colleagues, I'm not suggesting, so I don't get misquoted, I'm not suggesting that I would vote that or even move that, but I think it's important to see it and also see along with it a document which people seem to be gravitating towards is pushing that money to next year. I do think that we need a level of transparency, so that's what I'm trying to do, and the best way that we can show that is by having the option, and likely that's not going to pass, or it's not even going to move or get a vote, because I don't plan on moving it, but I think it's important for the public to see, and then showing the consequences of it for next year.
Well, if you're not going to move it, I wonder if it should just be a document prepared by staff, which I suspect would be less than a full-blown budget.
I mean, I can talk to Mr. Shields offline about it, but right now, I mean, I want time to think through it.
Oh, yeah, I didn't know we want a whole ordinance for it.
Mr. Mayor, could I ask?
It can be, excuse me.
No, go ahead.
Would you be okay with it being part of the staff report?
Let me think about that, and I'll get back to staff about it.
Okay.
Mr. Duncan?
All I was going to say was just to underscore my hope that in the next week, staff will be allowed some time to focus on the big picture of this budget and CIP and what it does, and update your PowerPoint presentation, which I thought continued to get better at the last time it was shown. I'm just loving it more and more. I'm really going to love it if it lands on a level tax rate in the end. Which is really the only thing that I want. You know, the budget chair here has not got a laundry list of things that he particularly wants in the budget. The budget now includes a number of items which I think are very important: transportation planning, radios, school planning. I support all those things. And I would hope that the fact that they are in the budget would encourage folks to be supportive of the final product. I would like for some time to be devoted in your next busy week to, a presentation and a story about our budget that will enable the city to rival the very impressive communications effort that the schools are able to expend on their budget. The structure of our system enables them to draft, present, and then promote their budget throughout our budget season, and we really boil ourselves down to the last day. And I think it's important for the community to see and hear the things that we're doing in this budget that are often lost track of because we do end up in some last-minute discussions and we don't set a tax rate sort of a week before we need to vote on it.
Okay, well, in terms of final markup, what we've got right now is...
We can stop on that point, and I think that's a fine point, but I'd be remiss to say I hope that we keep that balance, because there's a whole set of unfunded needs that show up in the budget book that aren't getting done, and we didn't have a heck of a lot of discussion about that, and I think those are important. As important as it is to show all the good things that we're doing, is that it is still a tight budget, and there's still a lot of stuff that's not getting done. And I do think that we do need a slide on last year's budget, at least somewhere in the staff report being reflected that we're already right now looking at cuts happening in this fiscal year budget, or underspending, et cetera, to get us through. So I do think that we need to acknowledge that somehow. So on I think there was 3 points there.
We've got 2 ordinances, and both of them have the CIP item for the school planning in them. The transportation planner in my memo, I lay it out as an option. Is there consensus that is in the 2 budget ordinances? Okay, so we will do that. So at this point, we've got 2 ordinances, and possibly a third.
And what I would ask is for the school board to take a look at the proposed, the alternative with the $340,958 cut from their budget, and tell us how they would adjust accordingly. That would be very helpful, because if in fact they can adjust and it's relatively painless, then it makes sense to go with the lower tax rate. If it cuts into the quality of education, something I won't support. So I would just ask the school board to give us a reaction to that. It'd be very helpful for making the decision, because if we can get to the lower tax rate, great, I'm all for it.
Okay, do you have what you need then, Mr. Shields? Is there any other comments that need to be made tonight? Ms. Messner?
One non-budget thing. Earlier this afternoon, I emailed out to council a request for concurrence for the mayor to sign a letter to ask the governor to veto 2 bills that we need to send the message down tonight that deal with license plate readers and data retention. It is consistent with council's legislative program. I just wanted to seek concurrence, and the letter is in front of the mayor if council agrees.
You know, of course, the mayor may not be able to go to Richmond after having signed that letter. No, that's fine. I think it's a good idea.
And just on that, Cindy, I haven't looked at it yet, but that's a topic I'm not gonna getting involved in. I'm not saying that there's necessarily a conflict, but it is an issue that I touch on, not necessarily directly, but I just probably best without talking to our ethics council that I not weigh in.
So if we can as well, well, I guess first off, is there any objection to me signing the letter Ms. Messner's proposed? All right, seeing none, I've already signed it, actually, but
Thank
I'll
you,
give it to
Counsel.
her. Secondly, there is, just to give you guys a heads up, there is a Solarize Northern Virginia Challenge. Vienna and ourselves have got a little, we're behind, by the way, pretty good amount, Dan. So, but the challenge is, I think the loser buys dinner, what's that?
What's the gap, really?
The gap's about 30 houses. which
Well,
is
it's
pretty
actually not as bad as, depending on how you want to do it from a wonk perspective, because last week we were at 41, we're now at 47. Vienna was at 66, but they only managed to be at 71. So we have,
In a couple of years, we'll be all even. Anyway, the bottom line is, if we lose, I think myself or someone's going to deliver dinner to the city council or the town council of Vienna. So
there is
When's
a
that?
solar, end of June. There is a Solarize, and I urge everyone here, as a matter of fact, to sign up to solarizefallschurch.org. And it counts if you get a free energy efficiency checkup. They'll give you light bulbs, they'll give you smart strips. They'll spend an hour and a half going through your house. It's free to you. It would normally cost you money. Dominion pays for this. So Dominion pays $150 for this. So this is a way of you all just being energy efficient, amping up the numbers. I understand the mayor's going to do this. He's already signed up.
I
So he's
signed
part
up
of the
today.
47 here. So that would be this Sunday, 2:30 in the community center. We'll have solar experts there.
thanks for all your help with this, Dan and Tim Stevens were big proponents of getting this off the ground. So thank you
There's
very
a fine
much.
picture here of Arbor Day on Saturday at Frady Park. Nice ceremony.
Sounds good. Anything else, Mr. Shields?
One other piece of good news is that Fairfax Water has informed us that they are planning to. One piece of good news is that Fairfax Water has notified us and will soon notify all their customers that there will be a unified water rate for all of their customers, and that means a reduction in water rates for our community, for the City of Falls Church, from the current $3.27 per 1,000 gallons down to the rate of $2.55. Which is about a 22% reduction in water rates, and that'll take effect on July 1st.
That's 6 months earlier than originally planned, so that's good news for the city. And Phil, you can take longer showers now.
Yeah,
So-
exactly. Thanks for working it out to the average household. It's $32, which is, $32. So thanks for that breakout.
Anything else? If not,
Move to adjourn.
second. All in favor? Abstentions? Against it? We're adjourned.